Thank you so much, Pastor Yacht. First of all, I just wanted to say, Pastor Yacht, thank you for your wisdom. And also, I would have loved to just have you just keep going, okay, with all the things that you're saying, because they were all things that were resonating with me. And my hope is that they are the same themes that I'll be able to pick up on and carry on within the message itself. So good morning. Welcome, everyone. It's good to see you all. As you probably saw, Pastor Yacht was reading actually a different version than what I had on screen. And thank you for doing that, because a lot of times when we look at different versions of the same story, another meaning comes out, or a more fuller meaning comes out. Take, for example, I thank you, Kitty, for picking the songs that you did, because they fit so perfectly. I was thinking about those exact same songs this morning, and now I don't even have to say it because they were already sung to you. But there's something that I noticed in the second song, because for those of us growing up as kids, singing "Open My Eyes That I May See," it's like there's a couple words that were changed. And which is not, there was nothing wrong with the way they were changed, but thinking about how it sings now and how we used to sing it before actually brings a fuller meaning to the song itself. If you recall, so I brought a hymnal up with me. I am going to read through the Bible, it's on slides, but I brought the hymnal up because I wanted to read for you what it says. And then, for those of you who are old enough to remember, think back on what were the original words of this song. Silently now I wait for you, ready, my God, your will to do. Open my eyes, illumine me, Spirit divine. If you recall, the words, if I can recall them correctly, silently now I wait for thee. Ready, my God, thy will to see. Open my eyes, illumine me, Spirit divine. In the second verse was also an interesting part as well. So this isn't necessarily a message on hymnology, but it has so much to do with what I want to be able to share with you today. Notice it says, open my ears that I may hear voices of truth so sharp and clear. And while the message sounds on my ear, everything else will disappear. If you recall, if my memory is correct, it was, and while the wave notes fall on my ear, everything false will disappear. That was actually what the original hymn sounded like. And my hope is that as we go through it, Pastor Yacht had shared with freedom, and it's just amazing, because that was actually what I've been thinking about all this week. It's like, what are our freedoms? And how does that bring about the society that we see today, but also the biblical revelation that we've seen going forward, and all this started because right after I finished speaking here last month, I contracted COVID. Okay, and so one of the things that happened while I was in COVID, quarantined, was actually a great time. People bring you your meals, all that kind of stuff. You stay, and the disease itself wasn't that bad actually. It was like having a cold. I'm grateful that I did have 2 shots and 2 boosters, and almost immediate. It was only like a few weeks before that I had the second booster. So my admonition and warning to everyone out there is continue to be careful, because even though you can get boosted and you have antibodies, it doesn't necessarily mean that you still can't contract it yet. Okay, and so I'm only telling you from our experience. Okay, and so again, be careful. But as I was there in quarantine, I think I watched like 3 movies. I finished like 5 different TV series that I've been trying to keep track of. I finished like 4 books during that time. And it brought me back to a time when I was the Christian school pastor. And we had this guy named Christopher Yuan. He was, many of you have probably seen his story. He was apparently a person that was a drug dealer and was also homosexual. Came out of that lifestyle, became a Christian, became a moody professor. Okay, a Moody Bible Institute professor, and I think he still is a Moody Bible Institute professor. Well, anyways, we had him at the church that I was at when I was a Christian school pastor. And I remember we had said to the middle school students, you can come in, him and I, Professor Yuan and I will be there, and you can ask them any question you want. Okay, we have these 3 middle school boys that come in. And I was thinking, oh, maybe they'd have questions on homosexuality. Maybe there's things that they just didn't understand about his story. And they come in and they ask him, what was it like in prison? Okay, is that what they ask him? Because he went to prison, and he said, and the answer just shocked these poor little boys. He's like, prison was great. He says, you got 3 meals a day. Nobody bothered you. You can study and read and do all these things you want. And I could see these poor 3, middle school boys just totally, I don't know if they were disappointed, but just confused as they just kind of walked out of the room after he had shared. But it just reminded me of that because, that sometimes it takes us being in isolation to all of a sudden allow God to be able to speak to us. And that's what I found myself. And, often we go through life, many of us, you're mostly either my age or older is what my suspicion is. And we've gone through a lot of life, and we think we know a lot of stuff. But sometimes I wonder if there are things that we need to unlearn or listen to relearn again or to learn in a new way. And so that's what I've been trying to do. I've been prompted by this because there was, for many of you who grew up during my era, you remember a guy named Josh McDowell, wrote Evidence That Demands a Verdict, wrote Right from Wrong. Many of you, when you became parents, you followed the Josh McDowell method to raise your children. And Josh McDowell, more recently, I think within the last year, had shared some of his thoughts. And they were the same thoughts that we have often espoused for the last 10, 20, 30 years. And when he did, he had some people come up to him and said, Professor McDowell, I just wanted you to know that's actually what you said isn't reality anymore. And it took him sitting down, listening to the stories of all these different people for him to actually boldly and courageously say, I'm going to take a pause on ministry and use this as a time to just listen. As you're going through CNN today, looking at the horrors that are going on all around us with the shootings, with what's happening in the legislature, what's happening just in the world in general, it's easy to be able to say, the country, our society is just terrible right now. It's easy to say that. But I would invite you to scroll down a little further in the CNN webpage to read an article by a pastor of an interview by a pastor named Pastor Andy Stanley. You probably know him in the old days because his dad is Charles Stanley, who used to be on TV a lot. He became a very well-known pastor in his own right. Pastors a very large church in Atlanta, Georgia, and has been kind of in the forefront of what does our evangelicalism look like in the future. And he paints a picture this way of, this is a point of challenge for many of us who are evangelicals. But I like what he said, and you can agree or disagree, but my hope is that you expose yourself to writings such as this, because he says something that I think is a message for us today. He says we can be concerned for our country, and we can stand for those things that are our concern in our country, but when we do that, we may only be reaching half the country, okay, because we are so polarized at this point in time. Rather, can we put ahead of our concern for our country the care for people? Because when we start to, when people know us as Christ followers that care for Him, we reach everyone in a case like that. My hope is as we go through today's message that truly that's what you will see, is that how can Christ be revealed in us? How can Christ be revealed in others? And how can Christ be revealed in the world? Seems like it's two very simple accounts. They're listed here in Luke chapter 18, verses 31 through 43. First we see here that Jesus calls together his 12 apostles. They're getting ready to go into Jerusalem. If you recall, this was their goal. If you recall, in the last message, we were talking about the guy that couldn't empty himself. And remember, we talked about some ways that we need to empty ourselves. And I found it interesting that, we had folks that would come up to me afterwards when I talked about intermittent fasting, like, I'm trying that, it's actually working. And so my hope is that it gives you, today will give you a different perspective on this passage than you otherwise would have had. So as we see this passage, we see that he brings together the disciples, and as he does this, you'll see that what ends up happening is that he reveals to them what is actually called by commentators the third passion. Okay, that's when he reveals, this is what's going to happen to me as the Son of Man. I'm going to be crucified. Everything that the prophet's saying is true. Okay, he doesn't do this. This is the third time. So he's done this once, twice, and now 3 times he's shared with the disciples this whole idea that I'm who they say the prophets say who I am. Okay, but notice what it says there is that it says in this passage, I still didn't get it. After 3 times, disciples are hearing Jesus saying, I'm him. Before, remember, if you recall, early on in Jesus' ministry, it was like when he would do miracles, others, shh, don't tell anyone, right? Now he's saying, I'm it, I'm him. This is going to happen. And the disciples don't get it. They still don't understand. You can almost imagine if you were there at the time, and if we were there at the time, with the same mindset as the disciples, it would be kind of like, huh? And he said it again. What's he talking about? Right? It would be that kind of feeling. And when you think about that, there was something that was hidden from the disciples. They just couldn't connect. You ever have those? We call it now aha moments, where all of a sudden you hear something over and over and over again, then finally it's like, oh, I get it now. Well, I think that was where the fog was still there for our disciples. They still didn't get it yet. But I found it interesting. Normally we see this as 2 different accounts. We see the fact that Jesus tells them the passion story, or the passion account, and the disciples don't get it. Then we see that he goes on and talks about the blind man. I found it cleverly put together by Luke to be able to say that these may actually be part of the same theme. Because he goes on, and as you can see, what happens is there's a blind man that's sitting there begging. And as I have highlighted, he's there in the crowd. The front of the crowd, so picture with me this, is there's a blind man in the back, there's the crowd that's in the front that's telling him to be quiet. Just like the disciples had something hidden amongst them and couldn't see it. The blind man, not only did he have no visual sight to see Jesus, he was physically blocked by Jesus. There's a crowd that was there in front of him. I wonder if a lot of the times when we can't see God in our lives, is it because the crowd's there blocking us, telling us to be quiet in our lives? Notice then what? The blind man persists. He persists to try to find out that, to find that ability to see again. Then notice what happens. Is finally Jesus reaches out. He gives him sight, and in giving him sight, now the crowd's no longer against the blind man anymore. Now they're on his side, and everybody is praising God. Could there be a time in our lives that everything looks so dark, like it is now, that all of a sudden something breaks through, and when that breaking through, that revealing happens, that everyone will praise God? I think that's the hope that we need to hold on to through these dark times that we're having now. So that was really the message. Now allow me to be able to then allow you to fill in the blanks. Our life is full of hidden things, aren't they? Entertainment world makes a lot of that, of this idea of something that we think it's fun. We think it's exciting. We think it's surprising in a lot of ways. It allows us to be engaged. It allows us to develop curiosity. And Fox channel leveraged that when they came up with this whole concept of the mass singer. That's what this is all about. And for those of you who have never seen the show or heard about it, basically it's these folks that are dressed up in costume, okay, and they have a mic. There's an opening where they actually sing. So it's supposed to distract you from who is this person, okay? And they start to give you little facts along the way, and then at the end, there's the great revealing of who that person is. And there's been some there's been some pretty controversial figures that have actually been revealed during this time. But it draws people to be engaged. It gets their attention because everyone is starting to wonder, who is that person? And you want to get to the end and to be able to see who that person is. That's the whole concept of this. You know, and this whole idea of masking, hiding something, isn't just lost on the entertainment world. Many of you who are car enthusiasts like me, you understand this whole idea of wrapping a car in camouflage, or I forgot what the actual term is that they use to wrap the car, so you can't tell what the car is. You know, because it's a prototype of a car that's going to be released perhaps in the next 6 months or the next year or in the next 2 years. Okay, and so I had shared this before in another church, and I had asked the congregation, do you know what car this is? And it was actually my wife that guessed it. Anyone know what brand of car this might be? Not quite. Look at the front. It looks like a Mercedes body type. Okay, if you'll see, it actually, I think it's that symbol that looks like an M. So Mercedes is close. It's a Mazda. Okay. Anyways, the whole idea is we see things that we know that in our life process, as we go in through the course of life, there are things that are hidden from us. That once they're revealed, all of a sudden we say, so that's what this is all about. One more, okay, for you. Okay, yeah, the guys have their heads turned away, but I think they are recognizable by now as to, of course, tell me who it is and what the statue might be. Okay, any ideas? I'll tell you, it is actually very symbolic during exactly this time, because there's something going on besides all the news that you're seeing. There in the news, there's also some positive news that is going on. Any ideas of who this is? You know, okay. This is Prince William and Prince Harry, right? And what they're doing is they're getting ready to, and right now it's the Jubilee period, right? Because they're celebrating the Queen, okay? And I think it's 70 years, 70 years, okay? And they're unveiling a statue of Princess Diana. Okay, is what this picture is. But in unveilings, right, things are hidden, and all of a sudden when they're unveiled, it's kind of like that revelation moment. Now, I don't want to use the word revelation because it trains in your mind. You're already thinking about the end times. I want us to think about revelation as to what is happening in the course of our lives. So that's why you're going to see me use the word revealings. So if you have your notes with you, I'd like to be able to share with you what are some of the facts that we see of what was hidden for the disciples and what was finally revealed. And then furthermore, I'd like to be able to look at, well, what's hidden in our lives that needs to be revealed and revealed in others. And when we see it revealed in others, what do we need to do? And when we see that God is revealed in the world, how do we need to act? So the first thing I want to look at is what was really revealed from the disciples. I think it was hidden from the disciples that was ultimately revealed. I think it was this. It was the whole idea that they couldn't comprehend the events of the crucifixion. It wasn't until they actually saw it that they started to put together the dots, connect the dots, and figure out what it's all about. The next thing that we see is that they probably didn't know what they signed up for. They thought, oh, they were just following Jesus. But they didn't realize that the cost to that was that they would have to experience suffering themselves. They didn't understand the whole cost of discipleship. That was hidden from them at the time. But if you notice, it wasn't like when they were revealed these things, the fact that they would suffer, that they shrunk back initially, but ultimately they got it. And I wonder if that's a process that happens when things are revealed for ourselves and for the world. And they accepted that Jesus would not be received by the people. They thought they were going to go in. They saw Palm Sunday. They thought it was all going to be that kind of thing. Just one big parade after another. And what was hidden to them was the fact that it's not going to end that way. It's going to end just like the prophets had written. So we see that these are some of the facts that were actually revealed from the disciples. Probably even if Jesus were to plainly tell them these 3 points, they still wouldn't be able to get it. It was until they started to experience it that even more that was revealed for them. So how do we react to those rather than calling them revelations? I know revealings isn't a real word. How do we react to the revealings that happen in our lives, in our society today? And I think I'd like to break them down into 3 different things. I think there are those times when God reveals himself to us. And I had one of those instances, and I'm sure many of you who've lived enough of life have had those. You just forgot about them or didn't think. They're those close calls, those accidents where all of a sudden it was out of your control and God took over. What are those types of instances that have happened in your life? And how can we anticipate or at least expect that? God's still got plenty more for us to do that he wants to reveal in our lives personally. And then what happens when we see God revealed in the lives of others? And how should we appropriately respond? And then finally, what can we do to remind ourselves that God is in control? That he's going to reveal himself in all his glory. But I just wanted to summarize and close out this part. Why did I say that these 2 accounts go together? Because in there you see 2 types of revealings, right? You saw the blind man. We're going to go the last one first. We saw the blind man receiving sight. And then we saw that through Jesus' arrest and suffering in Jerusalem, that there was a prophetical revealing as well. So I wonder if the actual theme of this text is not so much the accounts of what actually happened, what he said, how they responded, but rather there was an underlying theme here that God is going to reveal that which was hidden, both from, in this case, it was a physical sense, but also a prophetical sense as well. If we follow that theme and we think about it, it actually gives a fuller meaning. It's almost the same thing as we talked about the songs, as we talked about the passage, is that as we look at it from this passage, it almost gives a fuller meaning to what this is all about, this whole passage and how it is applied to our lives. But, before I do that, I want to detour on, how are our revealings do they actually occur? There was a term called 15 minutes of fame. Okay, that everybody will experience 15 minutes of fame. It's not a scientific thing. In fact, this phrase and how it's carried on through society has actually come by accident. It's because Andy Warhol, who was this contemporary artist at the time, they asked him, wow, what do you think about the fact that you're famous now? And Andy Warhol was trying to dismiss and say, everyone's going to receive their 15 minutes of fame someday. And somehow that phrase took on a different meaning. And so often we think of it as, what are those moments that all of a sudden all the attention gets turned on us and we have to respond? Have you ever had a moment like that where all of a sudden the room goes silent and everybody just turns to you to make a decision or to make a response? And maybe it was in a large context of a meeting, or maybe it was in a smaller context in your family when a crisis happens and everybody turns to you. Or maybe it was something that happened where you were alone and an accident happened and it was the defining moment where you had to make a decision. What are those quote unquote 15 minutes of fame. And how will we show up when it's our turn? When God shines the spotlight on us and says, okay, I've trained you for this moment in time. What are you going to do? Are we going to be able to show up in the right way? And as we do that, I want us to be able to again, focus on these three areas. Our revealings, the revealings of others to the gospel, revealing of God and all His story. And I'd like to give you some practical aspects of this as we also prepare later on for communion. The first one is in our revealings. You know, crisis is not something that we're immune to, right? We've experienced over and over, for those of us who've lived enough life, that prior to there being a pandemic, prior to there being school shootings, prior to all these things, we've had some pretty significant crises that have happened in our lifetime. One of them is represented by this picture here, 9/11. I remember 2001, very, very much so. During that time, I was working in a pharmaceutical company at the time, and I remember, you know, people would pour into my office, just crying, you know, saying, you know, my daughter's on a plane flight right now, and, you know, I don't know where it is, you know, and then finally it would touch down, and they would say, you know, they would come in and just cry and say, my daughter's safe. You know, and for many of us who had people that were in the air or I flew on Flight 93 before. You know, I know what it's like. It's the greatest flight. You fly from New Jersey to SFO, and you fly on the flight because not very many people are on it. So you get a whole row where you can lie down and sleep at whatever 6 in the morning. Okay, so it was a great flight. You know, and that was a flight that was chosen by terrorists to be able to use for their deeds. And unfortunately, there were some heroic people, individuals that are here, that actually lived here in the Bay Area, that overpowered the terrorists and downed that plane in Philadelphia, if you recall. It was a traumatic time during that time. And I remember asking myself, in fact, if I were to choose a turning point in my own life, ministry life, it would really be 9/11. It was where I had to start reflecting on, you know, what do you want me to do, God? I mean, is there more to life than just working in a day job? Is there more that I can do to invest myself in ministry? And I would consider 9/11 as one of those turning points. But before that even happened, on September 12th, the day after September 11th, I get an email. I'm at work. And it was a message that was from our president of the company. It's there on site in Palo Alto. And in that message says that we're going to gather at the flagpole for a moment of silence, okay, to honor those who died in 9/11. And for some reason, I never knew, you know, that I can only attribute to being a God thing. It was like I heard a voice that said, go to the president and tell him you want to lead in some hymns at the flagpole. And I'm thinking, that's ridiculous. Why would I do that? But it spoke so clear to me. President doesn't know who I am. I've never met him before. I've never been to his office or anything like that. But the next thing you know, I find myself walking towards the president's building and into his office. And I'm thinking, what am I doing? You know, first of all, I never could lead, you know, a song. I mean, I led, you know, hymns in church, you know, but I never led in a mass group without a piano. Okay, it was usually the piano drove me, and I just waved my hand. Okay, and so I never really led anything that way. But here I felt a clear call that God was calling me to go to lead these songs. I was like, okay, you know, God, I'm just going to move. And you got to clear the way. I get in the building. I find myself couldn't take the elevator. I take the stairs. I walk up these flights of stairs. I open the door for them. Many of you know what you can picture with me what office buildings are like, where, you know, there's a flight of stairs. There's no one usually in it. You open a door to get to the next floor. I open the door, and who is standing there in front of me who's ready to come down the stairs, the president of the company. And automatically, I'm saying to myself, Mr. Woody, my name is David Chu. I would like to lead some songs at the flagpole. I had no idea where that came from. And he's like, yeah, that's a good idea. And what's your name again? And then the next thing you know, I like, what did I just do? So I'm staggering my way back from the office. And I get back to my desk. And there on the email, broadcast to everyone in the company, David Chu is going to lead in some patriotic songs at the flagpole. And my friend, Gary, who is like, one of my best friends that also worked with me, he also grew up with me in church. He comes over to my office like, what did you just do? And I was like, I don't know. And I'm like, how am I going to do this? Is what I was thinking. It's like I never led anything that didn't, I tried to lead a cappella, and every time I did it came out badly. Okay, and what's more, I would get the choir members who would come up to me afterwards and say, you were off on that one. And I'm like, oh, gee, thanks so much. And I was like, oh, this is going to go bad. This is going to go bad. Next thing you know, I get an email from this guy who says, I have perfect pitch. I would like to help you. And I'm thinking, amen. How could that, and I'm saying to myself, how appropriate was that? And sure enough, we get up there. This guy hums in my ear the first note, and we go, and we sing song after song after song. My country, 'tis of thee, America the beautiful, all these different songs, Star Spangled Banner. We sang them all, during that time. And I was thinking to myself, what if I didn't move? What if I didn't allow God to show up? If I showed up, what would have actually happened? To this day, when people ask me, do you believe in God? Do you ever have doubts? I was going, yeah, I do every so often. But every time I do, I think back on that time. I think back on that time when God showed up for me, when I barely showed up for myself, and it continues to affirm for me, that God is real, and He's real in my life, and He's active. And my hope is that you have that type of 9/11 or whatever story where God just shows up for you. I'm sure if we just sent the mic around here, if you had a time to just stop and think, you'll see there are many instances in our lives where God just shows up when we show up. So we see, and I know I've often criticized people who've used this verse, Psalm 46, verse 10. It says, be still and know that I am God. I will be exalted among the nations. I will be exalted in the earth. My criticism is many have used this to say, oh, this is how we need to, as Christ followers, we need to be silent amongst, in order for God to listen. And that is true. But if you look at the context of that passage, it's basically saying, be still and watch while I annihilate this country. Okay, is what God is actually saying. So it's not your meditative type of verse. But I think there's an aspect of it that says something about our revealing in our lives. Is that there's a point in our lives, maybe we're not hearing God, or we don't think we see God being revealed in our lives because we're not being still enough. We're not listening. And then, though, there's more to it than that. And that is we need to act upon what God has instructed us to do. My hope is that the story that I shared with you, my own personal story, is one that allows you to be able to see, yes, we need to stop and listen. We know that God is in control. He may not show up in the way that we may like Him to show up, but when He does, we need to be able to act appropriately. The next thing I want to be able to share with you is this, is the revealing of the gospel to others. And that when we see God revealed, that we need to be ready to engage rather than disengage. There's a passage that we had covered once upon a time when I've shared here in Luke chapter 12, verse 3. And it was this whole idea that about the Pharisees, that they were silent in what they did. They didn't speak out about the truth. And Jesus responds in this passage that says, "Therefore, whatever you have said in the dark shall be heard in the light, and what you have whispered in private rooms shall be proclaimed on the housetops." I wonder if we not unpack this passage enough to be able to say, are there hidden messages that go on in our lives? God talks about mystery. He talks about all these things that are mentioned. Often the phrases come up and we just kind of gloss over them. And I wonder if there are still things to be revealed for us. That's the process that God uses. I remember there was a time where I would go on a trip with my brothers and brother-in-law. And during this one time, my brother-in-law, who's not a church-goer, had shared with us that he was very concerned about a procedure, an operation that he was having, and really was thinking about the end of his life. And I remember, and we're adults at the time, because I remember being married. So I know we were adults, and we knew enough of the Bible, and we've gone through Sunday school and everything else. And I was sitting there with my Christian faithful brothers when my brother-in-law shared about the end of his life. And I remember us being so befuddled as to what do we say to him. And so it was almost total silence until my oldest brother, who was the wisest amongst us, but was also struggling, said, "Well, it's a matter of faith." And that's all we could say. And I remember thinking back to time how ill-prepared we were to be able to engage a person who is thinking about the end of his life. I say that to you. Where are you at? If somebody, or your brother, your sister, your friend came up to you and said, "I want to talk about eternity," and would we be able to only respond, "Well, it's a matter of faith"? And I think where we need to continue to refine and hone so that when God shows up in people's lives, that we need to show up is to engage rather than disengage. Is how do we continue the conversation? Perhaps we need to practice it over and over in our minds. I found it very interesting that during this time of the pandemic, that we had this video conference where we'd often, for those of you who've been working, the first question is often asked of you when you get together in these video conferences: "How you doing? Are you okay?" And what ended up happening is we had a whole video conference session on how you doing, are you okay? And somebody actually said, during this pandemic, it's caused me to turn to YouTube broadcasting to watch broadcasts like this on YouTube. And I thought, how many times are we bold enough to be able to say that during this time of the pandemic, we haven't been able to meet as a church. But when we finally were able to, that there was an opportunity for us to engage, but we also continue to have broadcasts that are available to others as well. Would you like to see it? My hope is that we find ways that when God shows up for other people, when they start thinking about what is eternity like, that we would be able to show up as well. And the final thing I want to be able to share with you this, as we think about how God is revealed in our world, is that revealing of God in all His glory is going to happen, whether we like it or not. But my hope is that as we come to instances and practices like we're going to do today, is that we would use communion as a way to reflect that just as Jesus came, He will come again. And so my hope is that we put our hope in Jesus Christ during this time. With all the news, with all the uncertainty, with all the things that are going on in the world today, that truly we would remind ourselves that He's coming again. As we close, my hope is that we will wait for God to show up. I find it interesting and the proper use of this translation, because I think it speaks to the terms we know today. In 1 John chapter 2, verse 28, "And now, little children, abide in Him, so that when He appears, He may have confidence," or we may have confidence, "and not shrink from him in shame at his coming. As we think of these three things, may we be reminded God's going to show up in our lives. He's going to show up in the lives of other people. He's going to show up in the world. And my hope is that we are destined to be revealed as he has been and continues to be revealed in our world today. Let's close in a word of prayer. God, we thank you for this time that we can study your word. My hope is that what was revealed today is yet a truth and a promise to us that maybe we've forgotten all about. Or perhaps it was just hidden and we needed it to be uncovered. Or perhaps there was a crowd that was in front of us that was speaking all kinds of different things that kind of silenced our voice. And we need to emerge to be triumphant for you. And so, God, I pray that as we can ponder this whole idea of how God will show up for us and how he shows up for others, that we would be bold in our witness for you, that we would care for people more than be concerned about all the things that are going on in our world today. So we ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. Turn it back over to our song leading.